Becca for putting this together so quickly, and to the CSC for hosting this talk. Today I wanted to talk about what computing is good for. And I wanted to talk about that through a few of my projects. And also through these questions that, I'm sorry, I'm just having some issues with my notes. Okay. So through these two questions that I initially was thinking about when I was talking about, thinking about putting this talk together. So the first is, what counts as computing and where does it happen and who does it? And through the work of Casey Feisler, who's an information scientist and who conducted a study with a group of women, people of color, and LGBTQ plus groups who described a set of stereotypes about computing that prevented them from seeing their own highly technical work as computational. And so what they realized was that formal computing spaces are not the only places where computational work happens. And they posed the question, what might we learn from examining informal computing spaces that represent people who are traditionally underrepresented? And so I wanted to start with what might be considered a more informal computing space and work toward what might be considered more formal. And I've applied computing to learn more about two fields of interest to me. So the first is in thinking about labor and the post-industrial city and issues of urbanization. And the second in cultural heritage preservation. So I'm going to start with the first. And so the first happens in my work in Detroit, which is where I'm from. And in my field work, I came across this image from the Ford Motor Company archives, which at first glance, it wasn't incredibly distinctive from other strikes that I had seen pictured outside of the Ford plant in Detroit in the 1920s. So I'm somewhat familiar with labor history in Detroit because my parents immigrated there from Pakistan in the 80s, and it's where I grew up. And it what led me to choose to study Detroit as my subject of study in architecture. But then when I looked closely at the sign that this man is holding, which says, "Let's make Ford an American," I started to dig a little bit deeper. So that and the way that this worker's face and body are turned towards the camera sets him and the photograph apart from what I'd seen before. He's an immigrant worker who's frustrated with the health and safety conditions of the factory, like his counterparts. But as a foreigner, he and other immigrant workers like him endured the additional social and technological requirements that came with the aggressive Americanization programs that were a defining feature of the progressive era. It was in investigating these specific requirements of the Ford factory that pulled me into computation as a way of understanding the past and the present. But also in integrating computing into my own work, I've had to critically reflect on the harm and good that computing brings to the subjects that we interpret and study, which I'll talk about more. So these pages are from the Ford Factory Tour Books, which is an initiative that the company started as a way to kind of fend off claims of paternalism and bad treatments during these strikes. And on the right, you'll see buildings marked cities where Ford made plants. And on the left, you'll see people marked where Ford made men. So the images on the left slowly replaced the images on the right, which were found at the back of every tour book and marked a shift in focus for the company from advertising Ford-made goods to the company's ability to make men. And this was a famous phrase that the company touted, that the Ford man, when he was made by the company, was thrifty, he spoke English, he was clean and efficient, and efficiency is the key here. Ford needed his workers to be as efficient as the assembly line architecture that defined Fordism and popularized mass production and the distribution of the Model T. So the profit sharing plan, which was initiated in 1914, promised every worker who came to work for Ford a basic $5 wage and the ability to share profit. So to afford the very product that he or she worked on, but primarily he. And the city saw rapid growth in the city post-1914 with larger annexations of land by the city of Detroit to accommodate all these new workers. But it also saw the emergence of two island cities that were incorporated separately by Dodge and Ford to protect their tax bases. And you can see that on the image on the left with Highland Park and Hamtramck, which are the only little spaces in white. So within a few years, Detroit city lines encircled Highland Park and Hamtramck, creating cities within a city. And what resulted were two small factory towns that had very little to do with each other, but were economically, politically, and socially embedded within the city lines of Detroit. So the need to manage home ownership and keep workers within the orbit of Highland Park then became a priority for the company, not only because it was foundational to the workings of his plan, but also because the sustainability of the factory city depended on it. So I began going through the archives and I found foreign worker files, and I began plotting this with GIS using Excel sheets and categories within the archives. So you can see already the meticulous record keeping of the company in terms of address, nationality, which was sometimes confused with religion. And the workers' housing proximity to the factory I found was important because it made for densely populated neighborhoods around the park, around the plant. Which was also enriched by social agents deployed by the company. So if you know about the progressive era, you know about these social agents that go in and check for cleanliness and abiding by certain social and moral rules. So for this, Ford created a sociological department, that's what it was called, to study and monitor the lives of the company's foreign workforce, and enlisted 18 special investigative agents from among its middle management, and meticulously mapped out routes through the surrounding neighborhood. So this is a map of the agent routes. This mapping reflected a much larger concern. The worker handbooks would show that the map divided the city into districts, and each district was characterized, quote, by its physical environment and the kinds of inhabitants it had. So this was a big deal in terms of bookkeeping and the change of address. And the company emphasized its utmost importance to report change of address, and failure to do so might mean the loss of their position. So all of these requirements start slowly showing up with the appearance of the profit sharing plan and all of these new technological innovations. So scientific management experts like Frank and Lillian Gilbreth and Frederick Winslow Taylor and their studies on time motion became really important in terms of the company's attitude towards human efficiency and the company's likening of efficiency of the human body with the machine. The company used film and moving images to examine the relationship between the worker and the assembly line and documented. So these studies proved not only critical to the innovation of the assembly line, but led to the development of a photographic and motion picture laboratory. So as you can see here, all the men making the film and innovating it, and behind the lens are these middle management, primarily white men. So the technological innovations around imagery made the company into a well-oiled publicity machine and worked in two ways. It fended off suggestions that the social programs were paternalistic, but then it also was used as a spectacular advertising tool. So much so that at a certain point, Ford managed to outrival Hollywood in his production and distribution of films. So this, you can see the famous image of the melting pot, and that workers, once they abided by all the social requirements, could earn a diploma that then could be one step closer towards citizenship. So these films work as intended. The workers many times were shown with their backs to the camera, carrying on with their daily activities and the mundane task of walking to work, clocking in, clocking out, working on the assembly line. So viewers get a partial, if not complete, sense of these routines. But what these films didn't show were the conditions such as Forditis, which was popularized by Charlie Chaplin in modern times, these repetitive motion ailments and sicknesses that the workers suffered under, such close time management techniques, the lack of fraternizing for fear of unionization, and the lack of rest breaks, and the technology that turned into a panoptical design that allowed the workers every move to be seen. So I was thinking about ways of engaging people in this work outside of just publishing. And one of the ways that I did this was through a publication in Harvard Design Magazine that likened the techniques that were being used a century ago to those being used today. And I annotated interviews done by Studs Terkel in the 70s, who is a famous kind of oral historian, who interviewed Ford factory workers in the 70s. And this appeared as both an explanatory interactive online and in print, where the annotations kind of show the similarities and parallels between what is going on today in terms of the advancements of these technologies and how it initially kind of came to be. And one of the concepts that really resonates with me is Ruha Benjamin's The New Jim Code, which he says is the employment of new technologies that reflect and reproduce existing inequities, but that are promoted and perceived as more objective or progressive than the discriminatory systems of a previous era. So the idea here is to think about social patterns of discrimination and displacement that are sped up through technologies, but to also be aware that tech itself isn't creating the problem, but amplifying and deepening an existing problem. The other ways that I thought about engaging more publicly with computation and data visualizations and to engage in computing in a deeper and more serious way around the subject matter was this project at the Atlas of Love and Hate, which was a collaboration with a team of architects and geographers at the University of Michigan, who were looking at William Bunge's work in Detroit in the 1970s, who was a qualitative geographer and spatial theorist, who was so radical in his thoughts that he by the university and the government because of the mappings that he engaged in. So this is an example of some of the mappings that he did. And the whole idea of the Detroit Geographic Expedition was to use mapping as an instrument to lessen the suffering, poverty, and violence that characterized everyday life for many communities in Detroit, and especially Black communities. So this love and hate that he talks about was the complex condition that highlighted abundance and scarcity in the city that he thought of as a direct outcome of capitalism, and to show how investment and disinvestment were structurally enmeshed. So in his view, it was the responsibility of the geographer to respond to these social conditions. And he did this in one project called The Geography of Children in Detroit that showed the lack of play spaces for children. So this shows the abundance of rat-bitten babies in the city. This shows the ex-migration of capital from the city into the more affluent suburbs and the people who went with it. And this shows or critiques the commuter lines that ran through these neighborhoods and therefore led to what were called accidents that he called tragedies. And so his philosophy was that in making maps and visualizing this data, this was the first step towards changing the reality of these maps. And his idea was that in offering up these spatializations, this would empower communities to become knowledgeable about themselves and their own conditions. And so this resulted in a bunch of geographers and architects putting an exhibition up at the University of Michigan. And we engaged with mapping in the same way. We did kind of ethnographic interviews, and we used city data to then use GIS and other tools to visualize social issues, including the ways that people related with one another, including ways in which disenfranchisement and foreclosure was becoming more and more apparent, and also the social geography. So this was an entire wall that was wrapped with a figure ground drawing of religious communities and buildings in Detroit. So all of this work really inspired me to incorporate learning about the past and present through computation in a more profound way. And I did that in my work at Yale in the Department of Computer Science through projects on digital heritage preservation. So I was brought on to help with 3D scanning of cultural heritage sites, and we engaged in buildings and material modeling and wireframing and design, and building a custom street view panorama with the Yale graphics group and computer scientist Holly Rushmeyer, and designing and building a web platform from scratch. And so this was really a multi-partner effort. We were working with heritage preservation organizations in Europe and a tech organization called SMArchS in the Bay Area, who would supply a lot of this equipment. And we also partnered with architects and computer scientists and heritage experts in Syria. And so some of the things that I was thinking about as the social scientist on the project was really this idea of storytelling. And so this was one of my primary aims in thinking about digital heritage preservation, is that in working with data and displaying data on a web platform, how can we also be sensitive to the stories around these sites and what they tell us about humanity and what architecture represents? The other thing was the responsible data collection and ethical representation of sites that would be displayed apart from the places in which people lived. And so just remember that one of our major focus areas was Damascus, and this is going during an ongoing civil war. And the other thing I became really aware of is this language of risk. So who determines what is at risk and why? And is it just around conflict sites, or can it be also around environmental damage and the effects of destruction and disinvestment that capitalism also has on cities? And the other last portion was digital colonialism. So this term that kind of talks about what it means to collect data about a site as a very privileged Western institution, and what it means to represent that data, and thinking about ideas of co-ownership of data with the people that are collecting the data itself, and I'm thinking about means of representation. So the project first started out with a lot of data collection. And so we did an investigation of at-risk cultural heritage projects and what sites were deemed at risk by UNESCO and other heritage preservation organizations, collecting a lot of information about them, but also looking at the projects that were out there so that we don't do repetitive work, and to think about what we could add and contribute as an institution. And the other part of this, I worked with groups in Syria to have Skype sessions over what we wanted to collect. And so I worked on represent architecturally the plans and the places where some of the LiDAR scanning equipment could go, but also in terms of the kinds of stories that could be told through observation and the knowledge that people had about their own sites and what was important to them. We also teamed up with the Yale School of Architecture to create these visualizations around building typologies. And so thinking about the kinds of buildings that could tell a story and what was kind of important about the architectural heritage of a region. So thinking about residential architecture, hammam, religious bathhouses, and religious architecture and monumental architecture, and the materials that went along with each. And so I'm showing a lot of this really intensive database work because it was incredibly important to think about the implications of contextual work with this intensive data work that we were doing. And so we also wanted to create a literature database as a research repository where people could go and find out more about the sites that we were documenting and construct a social history around it. And so this really reminds me of Safiya Noble's work on algorithms of impression and as an information scientist, really thinking about the methods of knowledge production from the back end. So what's going on in archives and collections and how knowledge is accumulated and constructed and the narratives that come out of them. So really thinking about the interconnectedness between technology and society. So as part of the graphics group, the students that I was working with are also coming up with their own ways of novel cultural heritage platforms. And so one of the issues that cultural heritage scientists really struggle with is having all this different kind of media together in one place, from 3D models to photographs to videos to mappings. And so they came up with this platform called Cherub, which we tested across different users. And they came up with a way for the platform to be able, where users could look at the data and then compress it into a video and annotate it. And another platform was called Cherish, which took, again, different kinds of media. So starting from the left to the right, you can see a plan that is then superimposed by an axonometric drawing. And the tool allows the user to build massings around the intersection of the plan and the axonometric section, and think about the different social and architectural uses of the different masses. So I just want to really quickly talk about some of the challenges that we faced. So while we're really excited about the kinds of data that we're collecting and the progress that we were making with the team on the ground and the kinds of new tools and experiences and skills that they were learning, we also were facing the challenge of working in an area of conflict and with people who are really enduring a lot. And so this photograph is of the collection of photographs that were of one building. And we needed to think about a way to balance the needs of stakeholders and deadlines with the reality of what was going on the ground. And because there was a delay in physically sending a hard drive that had some of the heavier data of point cloud data and 3D models, we had to then create models with MeshLab out of these pictures. And so this is an example of one of the buildings that we created out of MeshLab, and really working with some of the tools like Cherub to annotate this and think about what that would look like when we did get the hard drive shipped over. Because of the delay, we had to come up with ways to show how we were doing, how we were making progress on the computational side. But I also really, this really made me rethink the field of computing and heritage, because how do we balance attention to human, social, and political needs of what's going on in an area that is enduring a lot of conflict, and proceeding with a project like this and advancing scientific knowledge. So this was the landing page of the platform, which was created by a team of about 3 people, including Holly Rushmeyer. And we created this custom street view panorama, kind of akin to a Google Street View, where you have a map and a plan of a building. So this is the Azim Palace in Damascus, and the user can kind of click on these little circles which identify if there's an accompanying text and 3D model, or in this case with the courtyard, which was destroyed in the 1920s, information about its reconstruction and the social history of the materials that had to be supplied during during the time of reconstruction. And then we had maps that users could scroll through to think about the geopolitical context of boundaries and nation making in the region, along with a blog. So this resulted in a first author peer-reviewed computer science paper, where we really tried to illuminate some of the challenges and advancements that we made with a project like this, and really thinking about the again, the good that computing can bring to a project like this, but also really thinking about how do we work through these challenges while advancing the field of digital preservation heritage. And so one of the ways I really engaged with this was through events and organizing programming. And so I invited Trinidad Rico to talk about the journey of heritage at risk, where she talks about the valuation of cultural heritage and at-risk categorizations, and also a symposium which brought together for the first time people from different fields within the university and directors of museums to talk about the use of computing and responsible data use in their own research. And this is kind of an ongoing project. I'm also co-curating an event with Andrea Wallace, who works on law and preservation, and Christine Khoury, who manages the Arab Image Foundation, on a symposium at the Met at the end of April that thinks about how digital practices can extend colonialism, biases, and inequities in and outside of the Universal Museum. So really thinking about digital surrogates of cultural heritage and how they're circulated, and laws and legality around it, and what in terms of the law has caught up to practices and what has not, and what the implications of that is, which I hope some of you, if you're interested, you can attend. And then another way I was engaging with this as I became more enmeshed with computing and coding is a project where I tried to look for different APIs within museum institutions to see what was available in terms of transparency around provenance and collections. And so I did run across this article written by the digital archivist at the Harvard Art Museum that really talked and grappled with some of these issues. And again, this is an issue of who is the person responsible for sorting and curating and making these APIs available to people, and what does it mean to have information available, what's opaque, what's transparent, what's easy to work with. So this is kind of a very tongue-in-cheek platform that I constructed that looks at different issues of provenance through this playful e-commerce way, where you can sort through and look at different artifacts and very fictitious valuations and look at and sort them by their provenance. And so I also just want to think very briefly about what does feminist computational science look like. And I came across this tweet recently by sociologist Jenny Davis, who commented on a brief history of gender in computing. So she writes, first, women became computers, and then computers became women. And of course, it shows the three women who kind of became famous in the popular consciousness through Hidden Figures at NASA, and then contrasts it with these digital assistants like Alexa. So Alexa is sold with a default female sounding voice and has a female sounding name. And these digital assistants are seen as kind of subservient and eager to please. And if you harass or abuse them, they'll feign ignorance or demur. And so much so that when Alexa is asked its gender, it responds, "I'm not a woman or man, I'm an AI." And so what does this mean in terms of the kinds of gender characteristics that assistants like Siri and Microsoft Cortana and Google Home are given, they are perceived to be female, and users can order them around without guilt or apology. And they're seen as kind of like having glitches that can be seen as inferior, and then kind of like determined to be a little bit ditzy if they don't work as well. And digital technologist Yolande Stringers, who does work on Siri and gender issues, says that the work that these devices are intended to do, making appointments, watching the oven timer, updating the shopping list, all of those kinds of areas are gendered and traditionally considered women's work. and therefore devalued. And so I just want to think about what it means for humans that we take for granted, that the disembodied voices that we boss around at home are female, and how does the presence of these feminized voice assistants affects the dynamic between actual women and men who use them. And so we see this again in popular depictions of AI in Hollywood with movies like Ex Machina and Her, where for her, the director notes that when asked about the roles of men and women in his film, his response was that Ava, who is the machine, is not a woman. She's literally genderless. And despite using female pronouns, the things that would define gender in a man and a woman, she lacks them except in external terms. And so in this sense, she's an android in female form, and reflects how Hollywood has been depicting women, robotic or otherwise. And in the history of kind of sci-fi, cyborgs are stand-ins for the other or the subaltern. And stories written about cyborgs and robots rising up are usually narratives told from the perspective of white males. But there's another way. And so there's a number of feminist thought leaders in computing ethics that are working to subvert this narrative. And in doing so, they're naming it and framing it. So in order to understand it, we have to have the language to name realities in order to see it. And so this group of feminist thinkers and writers are building up a language so that we can organize against systems of power that we're often unaware of. And so the idea is to be careful about the interconnectedness between data and the work that people can do. So I want to just point out some real world events and how some of this literature addresses it. And one is in Ruha Benjamin's Race After Technology and Safiya Noble's Algorithms of Oppression. They're really talking about racial technological redlining and this term new Jim Code, in which these data sets of the past are now becoming a little bit more amplified through systems that can discriminate against people. So in this case, in education systems that discriminate against students of different races. In terms of recruiting and resumes and hiring, where different AI technologies are trained on sets that privilege certain male characteristics over or female, or this kind of idea of old school redlining, which I kind of showed at the beginning in my work on Detroit, and how racial biases in redlining and home ownership can then make its way into our modern day kind of interactions when it comes to mortgage lending. And data scientist Cathy O'Neill, Joy Boylamini in her film Coded Bias, and Virginia Eubanks in Automating Inequality are really bringing attention to facial recognition and its effect on policing and the carceral state, and also how darker faces are then either unseen or cropped out altogether, as seen in this tweet by a PhD student who is really bringing attention to the effects of one technology Zoom had in erasing or kind of deleting the face of his colleague, but then also realized in posting it that Twitter showed the preview of his face rather than his colleague's face. So really trying to understand why these technologies pick and choose the kinds of images that they do. And also I wanted to think about how technology is being used in the past year with the pandemic, and how these issues that we're seeing with bias in technology can be subverted. And so Discord, which is originally like a gaming app for gamers and game developers saw more than a 15% increase in users by artists and artist-run organizations that don't generally associate or engage with these kinds of platforms. And they engaged with it and adopted values of identity, creation, and play that already existed on the platform. So again, this is really thinking about what are formal and informal spaces of computing, what's considered as fun, and how does that fun and creativity and engagement really pull people from untraditional backgrounds into the world of computing and thinking about advancing certain fields. And so I've done this in my work recently, engaging and teaching high schoolers at New View Studio in Cambridge. And in the course that I called Coded Bias, named after Joy Boilamini's film, we kicked off the course with the screening of the film and engaged in basic concepts of artificial intelligence. So how do data sets work? What is an algorithm? How does that get computed in a black box? What is the predictive output? They engaged with different online learning tools with feeding in different data sets of cats and dogs and learned about predictive algorithms. They started learning about coding with MIT's Scratch program, and their final project was to really think critically about designed and unconscious bias using programs and platforms that they use on a daily basis. And another course I'm co-teaching is 2D gaming as a narrative device. So how to use gaming as a tool for storytelling and learning design and coding using Unity, C# and Figma, and really engaging with this idea of play as a way of not only reflecting on one's own personal history, but to engage and empower these students. And so I just wanted to wrap up again with another study done by Casey Feisler and her colleagues that looks at the ethics of computing education. And so in her work, she's seen that including socially relevant examples and an emphasis on the social impact of computing has a powerful impact on participation and retention in computing for people from underrepresented groups, such as women. And additionally, ethical considerations permeate topics such as bias, workforce diversity, and accessibility, all important topics for cultivating culturally competent students who are able to think inclusively. And I think that that's one way to think about computing in terms of what it's good for, the contributions that it can make to advance the fields that we work in, and the way to think about the inclusion of underrepresented groups as actually widening the field for inclusiveness and for people who wouldn't normally consider engaging with computing in their own work. So that's it, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Great, thank you so much, Saima. That was really interesting and great to hear about all that different work and those projects. We have some time for questions. If anyone has them, please feel free to raise your physical hand and I'll keep an eye on those, or to raise your virtual hand with the Zoom option, or to put something in the chat, or we're probably small enough that you can unmute and start talking. So we will use all the mechanisms that, that might be used for any questions or thoughts. Mark, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for the talk. That was wonderful. I was really interested by the work on the digitization of architectural heritage. New York, of course, has amazing architectural heritage as well. Is there a space for that sort of work in the local environment as well? And what are the differences between working locally versus in a more remote setting, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, so some of those issues around digital colonialism and responsibility of data use and representation really came to the fore because of some of the existing power dynamics between working at within a Western institution with people who are living in the Middle East. And so I think that just complicated already the practice of digital preservation. But I think absolutely. Like using these tools to document and think about what is around you locally is a great way to also think about preserving underrepresented histories. And we did that. There were some side projects that I engaged in, which gave digital tours of New Haven, looked at the industrial heritage of New Haven, thought about the kind of lost immigrant histories of people who came there earlier, and New Haven as a hub, just like Detroit was. For industry and commerce. And so, yeah, I think that it's a great way to uplift narratives and histories that might not be known. And it's a great tool for local preservation.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions? So I have one. I'd love to hear a little bit more about kind of the making of this event that you have planned at the Met later. So how did that come out as an outgrowth of the earlier CS the Yale event that you mentioned, or maybe tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so the Near East curator at the Met saw some of the work that I was doing, and we'd been having conversations around an exhibit that's already up until the summer called Alien Property by Rayanne Tabit, who is a Beirut-based artist who really looks at his own relationship with cultural heritage through his grandfather's involvement with a German excavation. And so what he does in that exhibit is really unearths a lot of the bureaucracy around the trade and circulation of artifacts that were then circulated after this excavation happened in the 1930s. And under something called the Alien Properties Act, which allowed other institutions outside of the Middle East to start collecting these items which might not have been taken with permission, they basically, like, he's tracking where they ended up, what museum institutions have them, and really unearthing some of this paperwork to display it alongside the site. And the interesting thing about his project is that he has that personal collection, and so he also displays this quilt that his grandfather had passed down to kind of distribute among generations. So it started out as a large quilt and then gets distributed by piece by piece by piece. So then by the end, it just kind of disintegrates into generations. And he makes an analogy between the disintegration of that artifact with the pieces of cultural heritage that then become circulated, not just physically, but also digital reproductions of them. So yeah, I was asked to come on along with Andrea and Christine to really think about these things. And I think that after the events of the summer with Black Lives Matter and this ongoing decolonize the museum movements, museum institutions are starting to really kind of reckon with their relationship with cultural heritage and issues of provenance and repatriation. And so this is a way to take that head on and bring those conversations that are going on outside the museum inside of the museum, virtually in this case, but to really think about how effective structural changes can be made within these kinds of institutions.
Great, thank you. Any more questions? JJ.
Sure. This is sort of a broad question, but you talked a lot about sort of diversity and equity in the research sphere and the integration of technology and sort of everyday life. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your thoughts on how your research might be translated into the classroom. To what extent do you think pedagogy should be modified in order to make it more inclusive? Is it just an issue of opportunity and exposure, or do there have to be fundamental changes in the way we teach classes that may be hindered by unconscious bias or systemic issues that exclude certain groups?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking it. Well, I think I really started to seriously think about this in the New View class I'm teaching with high school students. First of all, I think engaging with young minds is incredible because they're able to really take in this information at such a quick pace and engage not only with the technology and the logic of coding, but really start to think critically about, oh, what does Snapchat do with my face and its recognition of my face, or YouTube, or TikTok, or all of these platforms that they're starting to use and think a little bit more critically about. And so yeah, I think you're right. It's about exposure. And so the curriculum, the non-hands-on tech curriculum, the reading part of it is all these feminist authors. So not only just like the film that I showed, but also the readings, little snippets, the articles that I'm exposing them to are all really feminist thinkers that are trying to rethink the field from the ground up to take in issues of gender equity and bias and discrimination. So I think it's really starting foundationally about how we start to think about the engagement with computing in scientific and social science fields. But also engaging with the act of computing at the same time. So I think these two things go hand in hand, and that's really why I structured my talk with my own work first, but then also introducing how these kind of technologies that seem so harmless that we use every day actually have real world implications, but then also what can we do about it? So it's not like a hopeless I'm not thinking about it in a hopeless manner where we have no agency. I think that there's a way to fundamentally reshape education to bring in an ethics curriculum to computing education that can then introduce concepts of ethics and bias alongside skills around coding and computation.
Any more questions? All right, with that then, please join me in thanking Saima.
Thank you so much for your time and your questions.
All right, bye everyone. Have a great
Bye.
afternoon.